When your in-laws treat you like an unpaid assistant and your husband sits in spineless silence, you don't throw a scene. You take total financial control. For 3 years, the Sterling family assumed I was just Julian's meek, quiet wife, who would endlessly absorb their condescension and carry their burdens without a word of protest. They had no idea that while they were plotting to strip me of my dignity and push me out of the family narrative, I was sitting on the executive board of Apex Equity. Today they think they are setting a trap for me, but by tomorrow morning, I will own every single cent of their defaulted debt. In the high-stakes financial corridors of Wall Street, I am known as a lead investment strategist at Apex Equity. Day in and day out, I analyze failing corporations, restructure toxic balance sheets, and deploy capital to acquire distressed assets worth tens of millions of dollars. In my professional sphere, CEO-level executives listen when I speak, and multi-million-dollar deals pivot on my risk assessments. But the moment I step across the threshold of the Sterling family estate in Connecticut, that reality is completely erased. To my husband Julian and his relatives, my career is treated as nothing more than a minor cute administrative job, a convenient cover for why I am not spending every hour serving their household. Julian and I have been married for 3 years. He isn't inherently malicious, but his complete lack of a backbone makes him an active participant in my mistreatment. Raised under the thumb of a domineering family, Julian has been conditioned to treat his mother and brother as the absolute authority in his life. Whenever his family patronizes me, makes passive-aggressive jabs about my background, or demands that I step back so his brother can shine, Julian simply looks at his shoes and whispers that I should just keep the peace. What the Sterling family never bothered to learn is that peace is a luxury built on power. While Julian spent years trying to earn his mother's conditional affection by running errands for the family firm, I was mastering corporate acquisition strategies. They saw a quiet daughter-in-law who stayed out of the spotlight, completely unaware that the very equity firm funding their luxury lifestyle was watching their mounting corporate liabilities. With my signature required on every single risk report, the power dynamic within the Sterling household had deteriorated from subtle condescension into outright systematic hostility. At the center of this toxicity was Julian's mother, Eleanor, a woman whose entire identity rested on the illusion of old money prestige and flawless social standing. To Eleanor, I was an outsider who had somehow slipped into her family's inner circle. A woman without a blue blood pedigree who refused to bow to her endless demands. Every Sunday dinner at the family estate in Greenwich became a tribunal where my clothes, my career, and my refusal to produce an heir on her exact timeline were dissected with sharp, quiet cruelty. Sitting beside Eleanor at the head of every family gathering was Richard, Julian's older brother. Richard was the golden child. Arrogant, financially reckless, and thoroughly incompetent. He ran Sterling Enterprises, the family's legacy manufacturing firm, as if it were his personal piggy bank, rather than a struggling business with shrinking margins. Richard viewed me with a distinct mixture of contempt and anxiety. He knew I worked in finance, and deep down he feared that I could see right through the inflated revenue reports and altered books he used to maintain his lavish lifestyle. Instead of holding Richard accountable for his disastrous management decisions, Eleanor directed all her frustration at me. She treated my demanding hours at Apex Equity as a personal insult to the family, constantly reminding me that a proper Sterling wife should prioritize supporting her husband's family over chasing a corporate title. "You should be helping Richard with his public relations, Victoria," Eleanor would say smoothly over dinner, passing a gravy boat without looking me in the eye. Woman's primary duty is to elevate the family stature, not obsess over spreadsheets in some cold Manhattan office. What made the environment unbearable was Julian's utter spinelessness. Whenever Eleanor made a dismissive comment about my work, or Richard blatantly ordered me to handle his administrative errands during family holidays, Julian would gently squeeze my knee under the table and whisper, "Just let it go, Vic. You know how Mom is. Don't ruin the evening." His passivity wasn't just neutrality, it was active betrayal. He traded my dignity for 5 minutes of calm at the dinner table, completely blind to the fact that his family was systematically eroding our marriage. Meanwhile, the corporate reality of Sterling Enterprises was crumbling beneath their feet. While Richard strutted around country clubs boasting about multi-million-dollar expansion plans, the numbers crossing my desk at Apex Equity told a drastically different story. Sterling Enterprises had taken on massive debt to finance failed supply chain ventures, defaulting on vendor payments and quietly mortgaging their remaining equipment. They were drowning in high-interest loans propped up only by high-risk credit lines that were rapidly reaching their maturity dates. The Sterlings were living on borrowed time and borrowed money, arrogant enough to treat me like a subordinate, while their entire empire hovered on the brink of insolvency. The breaking point arrived on a rainy Tuesday evening, when the managing partners at Apex Equity officially brought me into a private board session. Because of my performance over the past fiscal year, I was being offered the promotion of a lifetime partner and chief risk officer, accompanied by an executive equity stake that would secure my financial independence forever. The offer came with one condition. I would oversee the complete liquidation and restructuring of our regional distressed debt portfolio. It was the highest honor of my career, the culmination of a decade of relentless 70-hour work weeks. When I drove home that night, eager to share the incredible news with Julian, I thought for a brief moment that he might finally celebrate me. But as I sat him down in our living room and laid out the terms of the offer, his reaction wasn't joy. It was panic. "Victoria, you can't take this," he said, pacing back and forth across the hardwood floor. "If my mother finds out you're making more than Richard and taking an executive role like that, it's going to destroy the family balance. Richard is struggling right now with Sterling Enterprises. It looks terrible for us." The situation boiled over 2 days later at the mandatory Sunday family dinner. We hadn't even finished the main course when Eleanor set her fork down with a sharp clink against her china plate. The room fell silent instantly. "Victoria," she began, her voice dripping with artificial warmth, "Julian mentioned your little promotion offer. We've discussed it as a family, and we all agree it's time for you to turn it down. In fact, Richard needs a full-time executive assistant at Sterling Enterprises to manage his scheduling and corporate outreach. You will resign from Apex next week and take the position." I stared at her, stunned by the sheer audacity of the demand. "You want me to turn down a CRO position to be Richard's assistant?" I asked, keeping my voice dead even. "It's not a request, Victoria," Richard interjected, leaning back in his chair with a smug smirk. "Family comes first. My company needs dedicated staff who understand loyalty, not someone running off playing corporate hotshot in the city. Besides, you've been selfish long enough." I looked over at Julian, waiting for him to step in, to defend his wife against an ultimatum so utterly delusional it bordered on madness. Julian looked at the tablecloth, cleared his throat weakly and said, "Vic, maybe Richard has a point. It would help the family business, and it would give us more time to focus on starting a family like Mom wants." That was the moment something shifted permanently inside me. The respect, the patience, the desperate desire to keep the peace. It all evaporated in a single second. I looked around the table at 3 people who truly believed they owned my life and my future. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I simply took a sip of my water, looked Eleanor directly in the eyes and smiled. They thought they were cornering a defenseless domestic partner, completely unaware that they had just handed me the green light to destroy them financially. The next morning, I walked into the glass-walled offices of Apex Equity with a razor-sharp clarity I hadn't felt in years. The emotional fog of trying to earn the Sterling family's approval had completely cleared, replaced by the cool, calculated focus of a senior strategist executing a targeted takeover. I sat at my desk, signed the promotion acceptance letters for Chief Risk Officer, and officially gained full executive oversight over our non-performing commercial asset portfolio. My first act in my new role was to open the confidential distressed debt ledger. I pulled up the comprehensive file for Sterling Enterprises, and what I found went far beyond routine corporate mismanagement. Richard hadn't just mismanaged the family business. He had driven it directly off a financial cliff. To maintain the illusion of profitability, he had taken out a massive $12 million high-interest asset-backed loan through an institutional intermediary 3 years prior, using the family's historic Greenwich estate and their primary manufacturing facilities as collateral. The loan had reached its final maturity date, and the first major default notice had been issued 48 hours ago. Richard had been quietly hiding the letters, desperately shuffling money between secondary accounts to pay off single-interest installments while the principal balance ballooned. The primary lender was looking to cut their losses and sell the toxic defaulted note to an aggressive private equity firm for pennies on the dollar to offload the risk. I looked at the audit trail on my monitor and realized the exact leverage I held. The Stirlings were sitting in their Ocean View dining room, demanding my resignation and treating me like an ungrateful subordinate, while the literal roof over their heads was 48 hours away from being auctioned off on a public courthouse step. They were completely insolvent, and Richard's pride was keeping him from admitting that his empire was dead. Instead of blowing up Julian's phone or confronting Richard with the documents, I remained completely silent. I didn't drop a single hint at dinner that night. I listened calmly as Julian reminded me to draft my resignation letter for Apex soon so Mom doesn't get upset. I simply nodded, smiled, and returned to my study to prepare the legal acquisition paperwork. They wanted a devoted family manager. I was about to give them a masterclass in corporate ownership. By Thursday afternoon, the acquisition strategy was fully motioned through Apex Equity's Special Situations Fund. As Chief Risk Officer, I had direct authorization to execute expedited debt purchases for distressed commercial assets without requiring broad board approval for transactions under $20 million. I called our chief legal counsel into my office, laid out the full financial position of Sterling Enterprises, and initiated the purchase of the $12 million defaulted note from the primary lender. Because the loan was in active default and the risk profile was extremely high, Apex acquired the entire debt note at a heavily discounted rate of $8.5 million in cash. Within 4 hours, the wire transfers cleared. The legal assignments were executed and the entire debt package, including the personal guarantees signed by Richard and Eleanor, along with the deeds to the Greenwich estate and manufacturing plant, was officially transferred under the direct control of my division. I was no longer just Julian's wife or an employee at a Manhattan firm. I was now the sole legal holder of every single dollar of debt the Sterling family owed. Every asset they owned, every piece of real estate they bragged about at their country club, and the very business Richard ran was now entirely subject to my discretion. That evening, I personally signed the legal acceleration notice. Under standard commercial lending laws in Connecticut, a defaulted debtor whose note has been acquired by a new primary lien holder can be issued an immediate demand for full repayment or face summary foreclosure and asset seizure. I set the formal execution date for the following afternoon right in the middle of Richard's emergency board meeting, where he planned to announce his new expansion plans to the family and shareholders. When I got home that night, Julian was sitting on the sofa, scrolling on his phone. He barely looked up as I walked in. Mom asked if you're coming to the Sterling Enterprises board meeting tomorrow, he said casually. She wants you there to take notes and help Richard with the presentation slides. I'll definitely be there, Julian, I said softly, hanging up my coat. Wouldn't miss it for the world. The mahogany-paneled boardroom of Sterling Enterprises was filled with tense energy on Friday afternoon. Eleanor sat near the head of the long conference table, her expression serene as she held court among minor investors and family members. Richard stood at the podium, adjusting his silk tie and clicking through a PowerPoint presentation that touted fictional growth projections. Julian sat near the back, looking quietly relieved that the family seemed unified. When I stepped into the room, wearing a tailored charcoal suit and carrying an executive leather folder, Eleanor frowned subtly. Victoria, you're late, she said in a sharp whisper, gesturing toward a side table near the coffee station. Sit over there and take minutes. We're about to start the restructuring overview. I won't be sitting over there today, Eleanor, I said evenly, walking straight toward the head of the table. Richard stopped mid-sentence, his face re-ening. Victoria, what are you doing? This is a private corporate meeting. Stop embarrassing yourself and sit down or leave. I reached into my folder, pulled out 3 copies of the legal acceleration notice, and slid them across the table. 1 to Eleanor, 1 to Richard, and 1 to the company's lead legal counsel. 24 hours ago, Apex Equity acquired the entirety of Sterling Enterprises' $12 million defaulted debt note, I said, my voice echoing clearly across the silent room. As Chief Risk Officer of Apex Equity, I am officially executing our contractual right to accelerate the balance. The full $12 million along with accrued penalties and interest is due immediately. Richard's face drained of color as he scrambled to grab the paper. This is a bluff. Apex doesn't. You don't have the authority. Read page 4. Richard, I replied coldly. Your personal guarantees, the deed to the Greenwich estate, and 49% of voting shares in this firm were assigned as collateral to the primary lender. When you defaulted on Tuesday's payment, you forfeited protection. You have 90 minutes to wire $12 million or Apex initiates immediate asset seizure and receiver HIP. Eleanor slammed her hand on the table, her composure completely shattering. Julian, control your wife. What kind of sick game is she playing? Julian stood up, looking panicked and completely out of his depth. Vic, please, what are you doing? You're going to destroy my family. Just talk to us. I turned to look at Julian, feeling neither anger nor regret, only an absolute freeing clarity. I gave you 3 years to support me, Julian. Instead, you stood by and watched your family try to reduce me to their servant. Your family didn't fall apart today because of me. It fell apart because Richard is incompetent, Eleanor is arrogant, and you are a coward. The silence in the room was deafening. The company's legal counsel looked up from the document, his face grim as he turned to Eleanor and Richard. She's not bluffing. The paperwork is airtight. If we can't produce $12 million by 4 o'clock, Apex Equity legally owns this company and the estate. Panic erupted in the boardroom. Eleanor broke down into quiet, hysterical weeping as the reality of their bankruptcy crashed over her. Richard sank into his leather chair, staring at the table in absolute ruin. Julian took a step toward me, reaching out a hand to plead, but I picked up my leather folder and stepped past him without another word. By 5 o'clock that evening, the papers were finalized. Sterling Enterprises went into court-ordered receiver HIP under my division at Apex Equity, and foreclosure proceedings were initiated on the Greenwich estate. 2 weeks later, I filed for divorce from Julian. He tried calling dozens of times, leaving long rambling voicemails begging for forgiveness and asking if there was any way to save his family's reputation. I never called back. Today, I sit in my corner office on the top floor of Apex Equity, looking out over the Manhattan skyline. The Stirlings finally learned the lesson they spent years trying to teach me. Power isn't about loud demands or old titles.